Hi, welcome to this episode of Higher Dimensions. I'm your host, Aaron Tomlinson, and I want to thank you for joining me. I want to talk in this episode about shadow work. Uh, I've done some videos on the shadow self, and I've had a lot of questions from people asking me, how do I do shadow work? And I wish I could tell you that there's a four-step process that works in every situation for every person, and you just follow these steps, and boom, you'll have integrated your shadow by next week. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. The person who gave us the concept of the shadow self is Carl Jung. And Carl Jung himself would say that it's a lifelong process that we go through, and that for most people, we don't begin that work until the second half of our lives. And I've certainly found that to be true in my case. So let's define a little bit better, perhaps, the human personality. One of the problems that we run into is that we get stuck in what linguists call nominalizations. Now, the word nominal means to exist in name only, to exist in name only. And all language is simply a description of our experiences. So when we talk about a nominalization, we're talking about something that exists in name only. Let me give you a few examples. A couple comes in for marriage counseling and they say, well, we're here because our marriage is terrible. We don't have a good relationship, and we think it's because we have poor communication. So let's take those three terms: marriage, relationship, and communication. Those are all nominalizations. They only exist in name only. And here's what I mean by that. We treat marriage like it's a solid thing or a noun instead of a process. So marriage is simply a relationship, another nominalization, another noun that is actually a process that we turn into a noun. We nounify it and make the process a thing in and of itself. So a relationship is simply the way in name only that we describe the process of relating. It's useful if we understand that as a term. But if we mistake the name for the thing, we say we have a marriage, we have a relationship, and we begin to think that it's solidified. We have a bad marriage, it's solidified. We have a bad relationship, it's solidified. We've taken the process and made it a noun, and in our minds, we have confused the nominalization for the thing itself so that we're trying to work on a noun, an object that doesn't exist, the relationship in this case, an object that doesn't exist, we're trying to work on it, rather than realizing we have to work on the entire process. We have to explore the verbs of how you are relating. So for example, sorry, there's a fly. So for example, one could look at their communication process and start to understand and explore how they are actually acting in the communication process, and then change certain behaviors or certain actions or certain ways of being throughout that process that improves the process, thus improving what we call the communication, the relationship, and the marriage. What does this have to do with the shadow self? Well, it has to do with the personality or the shadow itself. When we talk about the shadow, we're talking about a noun, but we're doing it in name only. The shadow itself is actually a very complex process that goes inside the process of being a person, or what we call personality. So we have various different ways of being and experiencing ourselves in the world, and those ways are a process. They are experiences that exist in the moment, and they come into conflict with each other. So in one sense, we don't have one personality. We don't have one person that we are, one way of being in every single situation. We are a complex of many personalities or many ways of being, or what some authors have chosen to term ego states that exist inside ourselves. So you can begin to do shadow work by identifying and even naming, nominalizing, naming the personalities or the ways of being that you experience in different contexts or different times in your life. So, for example, I know that inside of me I have a Braveheart. I have the Scottish warrior who's ready to lay down his life and fight for anything and can face anything and is ready to go to war for a good cause. And I've experienced that part of myself. I also have a scared little girl inside of me who is afraid of heights and afraid of certain social situations and afraid of being judged and afraid of conflicts and just terrified. I have inside of me the evangelist preacher who wants to go and win the world with my ideas and convince everybody that my way is right. And if you want the best life, you'll just follow my way. And then I have the peacemaker inside of me that says, everybody's different. Can't we just all sort of get along? I have the merciful side of me, the compassionate side of me, the doctor or the nurse inside of me that wants to make everybody feel better and understand everybody's pain. And then I have the serial killer inside of me that wants to just inflict pain upon certain people or whatever for the sake of the enjoyment of it itself. Just bringing a little brevity with the serial killer part of me. So please don't take that too seriously or out of context. But I'm saying there's a ruthless personality that's in there as well. There's sort of the Michael Landon in Little House on the Prairie, Jonathan Ingalls inside of me that just wants to be devoted entirely to marriage and family. And then there's the Don Juan inside of me that wants to seduce anyone I see or whatever. We all have these parts inside of us. It's just the degree to which we're willing to accept and experience and integrate those things. And so shadow work begins by understanding that we have all of these different complexes of personalities inside of us that show up in various different contexts. Now, what can happen is and let me back up. So they are actual personalities. Each one has a belief system. Each one has a way of feeling and thinking, a way of being and experiencing that is independent of the other. So for example, the Braveheart inside of me and the scared little girl inside of me have completely different worldviews, completely different beliefs about self, completely different experiences and sets of experiences and even memories to go off of. And so you can imagine how those two parts can come into conflict at times. And either one of those can become parts of the shadow self, the Braveheart self that is too ruthless, if you will, that's too much of a warrior and doesn't fit in, can at times feel shamed and pushed into the shadow or pushed into the corner. And the scared little girl comes out that maybe exercises wisdom in certain situations, that maybe tones down aspects of the personality so that there's more compassion and prevents too much ego or bravado from coming out. So those could be some of the strengths that the scared little girl has. But when you're afraid of heights or afraid of people or certain situations that aren't rational because that scared little girl thinks like a little girl and isn't rational, then she gets pushed off into the shadow self. So we have different parts of ourself that go into the shadow and come out of the shadow and come into the light and find expression and don't come into the light and find expression. And there can then be a war that goes on inside of ourselves. Now, when we judge these parts of ourselves as inherently good or evil, rather than understanding that they all have strengths and they all serve us in the proper context, then what happens is we can suppress and completely deny those aspects of ourselves. Now, the problem with this is that when you deny aspects of yourself and suppress them, you're creating resistance inside of you, and resistance creates resistance. So the more you try to push down a part of yourself, the more that part of yourself is going to try to show up in your life. The more I suppress a personality, or if I take one and suppress it completely, then that is going to show up somewhere in my life. More often than not, according to Carl Jung, where it's going to show up in your life, and actually according to Jesus, because Jesus alludes to this as well, when he talks about why do you see the speck in your brother's eye but don't see the plank in your own eye. Carl Jung is saying that what we do is we project the shadow self onto other people. We begin to see that part of us begins to be out there, not in here, not part of me, but out there and showing up in the other. And because I hate that part of myself, I begin to express that hatred that I have that's actually in me towards where I think it's showing up in the other. So if you think about what Jesus said, if I have a plank in my own eye, when I'm looking through my eye, what am I seeing? seeing the plank. So when I'm looking at my brother and I'm looking at his speck, what I'm actually seeing is the plank. And so what's the issue? Jesus said, take the plank out of your own eye. Well, how do I do that? I have to own all of my experiences. I have to understand that every experience I have is part of my consciousness. Even the experience I have of an other is filtered through my own beliefs and personalities and self and consciousness. And so what can happen with my shadow is I can experience the other through the filter of my shadow because I don't own it as part of myself. I project it onto the other person, the problem's out there, rather than the problem being in here. So to begin shadow work, what I would suggest is that you begin to get to know yourself. You begin to get to know all the different parts of yourself and begin to accept them. That means that you have to remove all judgment and all resistance to the parts of yourself that you formerly didn't like or didn't appreciate. And then try to begin to find the contexts within your life where those parts actually serve you. You know, some people think that emotions are good and evil in and of themselves. Just to kind of give you an example of this, let's take it from a biblical Christian perspective, because religion is probably the biggest enemy of shadow work. So if I have certain emotions, I could list certain emotions as positive emotions and certain emotions as negative. On the positive side, I might list things like love, joy, peace, those kinds of things. On the negative side, I might list things like anger, hate, sorrow, or depression. But if you look at the person of Jesus, he experienced all of those things. In the book of Hebrews, it says that Jesus loved righteousness but hated iniquity. So love wasn't inherently good and hate inherently bad. Hate was good in the right context. Love is good in the right context. We can experience sorrow in the right context. If someone close to us dies, if we try to deny that we have to experience any sorrow, we're doing great psychological damage to ourselves, because the whole grief process is to help us transition our way of being and come to a place of acceptance of what life was like before our loss and what life is like now, so that we can actually live authentically in the present moment. So grief in the right context is to be embraced. So we shouldn't label our emotions as good or bad, but understand they're all energies that are serving us in the right context. In the same way, all the personalities that have developed inside of us have good qualities and are things that serve us in the right context. There are also other aspects of our personality that need to be transmuted, that need to be transformed, or need to be changed. And they're transformed and transmuted by looking at them, accepting them, and loving them. For example, one of the shadow parts that I've worked with a lot is the perfectionist inside of me. I call this one the ruler, because he tries to rule everything and everybody. But he also, when I imagine him, he carries a ruler because he's always measuring things to try to find their perfection. And when I was working with that part of myself and I asked that part of myself, what do you need? The answer came back so clearly: I need love. But yet it was the strategy of the perfectionist that love has to be perfect, that people have to be perfect in order to love them, or people have to love you perfectly in order to feel loved. And so you could see how that part was getting in the way. That part could serve me if I needed to do a good job at something, if I wanted to self-improve, if I wanted to strive for something better, then that part of me that's a good critical thinker, that's not afraid to challenge, that part of me can be very, very useful. But when it comes to relationships and love and experiencing that, it's not so useful. But because that's the love was the thing that the perfectionist was hungering for so much, oftentimes in my relationships, it would be the perfectionist that would show up because the perfectionist was trying to get his needs met. If you think about perfection in love, it doesn't exist. We never bond with people based on our perfection. To be perfect is to not need anybody else. We actually usually bond together about our weaknesses. Someone brings something to our life that we were missing. Someone helps us in an area that we need help, and so we enjoy that person. And it's the imperfections that actually bring us together, and it's that need for perfectionism that drives us apart. So once I could accept a perfectionist instead of hating the perfectionist, once I could understand that part of me needs love, and I could begin to think, how can I help that personality find love and find expression in appropriate context of my life while transmuting that expression in contexts that didn't serve me, in this case in relationships, helping that part of me understand that perfectionism is preventing you, that strategy of perfectionism is preventing you from experiencing the thing you want most. So let's honor you as a part, let's honor you as a person, but let's see if we can tweak the strategy so that you can experience what you really need without getting in your own way. That's a very brief example of work that took a long time. So I hope this helps you. Again, get to know yourself, get to know the different parts of yourself, name different parts of yourself, notice when they're showing up in your life. Own everything about your experience. Understand if you're attacking someone, if you're triggered by someone's behavior or way of being in the world, it's probably showing you something more about yourself. And if you'll quit projecting onto the other person and start doing that inner work, life becomes just so much better for you. So there's some keys to shadow work. Get to know your parts, accept them without judgment, own all the parts of your experiences, try to find out what those parts need and ways that they can find those needs to be met in a way that works for you and serves you and doesn't do harm like the serial killer on other people. I hope this was helpful for you. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, I'd encourage you to do so. Also turn on the ringer. It'll notify you when I'm doing stuff and putting stuff out there. Thank you again for watching, and whatever time it is, wherever you're at, I hope it's great.